as you can see in this lesson, I have a CSS file open and a JavaScript file open. That's because I'll be introducing you to CSS and JavaScript and HTML through a small project, and that's going to be making an actual incrementing button that will increment a value that the user puts in every time a button is clicked. Let's get into it. I'll explain as we go in. So let's just start with some basic HTML stuff. A title. This is what we'll see in the tab. Let's call this increment button. Yeah. So let's use the new header attribute. This should be a new attribute, and if you use Word, you know that a header is like a part of the document that's at the top of the document. If this is the entire document, it would be at the top, and you can write text there. That's pretty much what this is. It's at the top of the document. Yeah, there's a separate tag for it. The other header tags, like this, are just controlling the size. That's it. You can also see that I've switched to dark mode because of the contrast. I think you'll be able to see it better. Now, we do need a closing tag. As you can see, it's sort of auto-completing for me. For the header, let's call it increment button. Incrementer button. Increment button. Yeah, that'll do. Now let's make a body attribute. This one does need a closing tag as well. You'll see some tags that don't actually need a closing tag this time, and you'll actually need to remember those because you won't always have autocomplete pretty much. This is just special to Chromebook. And first, let's make an input field. Sorry, input. Right? So this is an input tag, and what it does is it actually creates an input field that the user can put in inputs for. These can range from integers to strings to pretty much anything. Now, we do need to specify a specific type of input, or like what type the input is, like what exactly it is. For us, this will be text, right? And let's designate an ID. You'll see why later. This is actually really important. And finally, let's start with a default value. Since we're going to be looking at this from JavaScript, and if the user just clicks the increment button, we don't know what's going to happen. We should be prepared with a default value. And that's kind of just common sense. And as you can see, this tag has no closing input tag. This tag doesn't exist, and it's yelling at me. So yeah, this is one of those tags. The next thing we need to do is actually make a button using the button tag. It's auto-completed it for me. That's nice. Now, for this tag, it creates a basic little button that the user can press, and you'll see more on it later. But for now, let's write some text on that button. Yeah, on that button. This will be written on the button that the user presses. Now comes a really important attribute, on click. This does exactly what you'd expect. Well, for us, we're going to use it to run a function when the button is clicked. That's what the onClick attribute is used for here. And we haven't actually created the function yet, but that's fine. We'll call it button click. And we do need parentheses, and I'll show you why later. Let's see what we have here. I have the developer tools up. You can get to here by going to More Tools and Developer Tools, or just Control-Shift-I. This can help you see some stuff. It can help you see the console where any errors will be printed. If you have, they might actually help you with troubleshooting. And you can see all the elements as well as some other stuff, but we don't need those for now. You can see we have a header, an input field, and a button. The button says increment, exactly like we wanted. Now let's get into another concept. CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. I'll talk more about it later, but what we're essentially going to do here is apply certain attributes to different tags here in HTML, and it's going to make the tags and the space that they occupy look different. That's actually a big use of div tags. If you have stuff in divs, you can pretty much change the style of that entire thing in the div, no matter how many tags you have in there. It could be any multitude of tags. You could change them all with the div. That's why divs are somewhat important in HTML. So let me show you something interesting. We can apply a style attribute to the header. What's the header? That's this. That's what the CSS is going to be looking at, once we link it, of course. And what should we do? Let's start with something simple. Let's align the text with the center. That's what this is. You update the text align attribute, and you're going to set it to center. That's going to align this header to the center. Once we link it, of course. Let's actually show you how to do that now. We would use the link tag, which is actually another one of those special tags that does not have a closing tag, as you can see. Now, for this tag, the way we link a style sheet is actually somewhat complex. First, we need a rel attribute. Oops. And we would write style sheet in it to basically tell the HTML file what exactly this thing is. And we would also need to specify a type. Oops. Type text/CSS. Yeah, that's also fairly straightforward. That's the type of the style sheet. And we also need to reference the style sheet itself, because as it stands, there could be any other file in this directory. This is just showing some of the files. They're actually in the same directory, by the way. What we need to do to make the HTML file see the CSS file is use the href attribute. And I'm actually going to type in button.css because that's what this is. But key point, if the CSS file and the HTML file were not in the same directory, you would have to type out the full address of the CSS file. You could do this in Windows by, I believe, right-clicking, and you should see some way to save or copy the file address. That's what you'll be copying. But you may need to edit it in relation to the buttons directory. So if I hover over it, you can see the address for the button.css file. That's myfiles/download/button.css. If it were in a different directory, if the HTML file were in downloads, I believe, we would have to do something like that to take it from the HTML files downloads folder to the folder that the button.css is in. Actually, sorry, we would have to have a separate folder we would have to specify that folder. Let's call it folder 1 if this was in a separate folder. So yeah. We actually don't have to do this here because it's in the same directory as I mentioned before. But this CSS should be linked, so you should see the header be in the center, and it is. Let's also do something different. So let's take the body attribute, which is this entire thing here, the input field, the button, which should be these, these, this, and this, and let's have some fun with them. What do we want to do? Let's align them with the center, like we did before. Okay. What if we want to do something else? Let's set their background color. Since the body actually encompasses the whole thing, and you can see what exactly each tag encompasses on the actual website. Yeah, it doesn't know what the function is yet. By looking at the actual elements, the header doesn't actually have anything in it. It's just linked. You can see that's the space the header takes up. That's the space the body takes up. That's the button. That's everything, pretty much. You can also see some other cool stuff that I'll get to later. Let's say I wanted to set this background color to a built-in color, because normally what we'd have to do is set an RGB value, which is a hexadecimal, which I'll show you later, but for now let's use something simple. Let's go with tomato red. Now what you might be noticing is that this and this don't look the same as this. There's a reason for it. It's actually because this won't work, and you'll see why soon. Yeah, it didn't work. Why? Well, in CSS, when you have multiple style attributes like this, you would actually need a semicolon here. With one attribute, it's optional, but for two, it's required in between those, so that the environment or the browser that's running your website knows where one attribute assignment begins and the other ends. So yeah, this should work now. And it's a nice shade of tomato red, and this is in the center. The increment button still doesn't work, and in the console you can actually see why. It has no idea what the button click function is, which is actually what we're going to define now. We're going to get into the JavaScript now. So the first thing you should do is actually reference your style sheet. It actually has a different tag for referencing than CSS, and it actually has a closing tag. It's the same thing that you would use if you wanted to write JavaScript in HTML. You could just write, let's say, you could write JavaScript in these two tags. You could write JavaScript between them inside an HTML file, specifically if you use these tags. Now, you do need an ending tag. Yeah? Okay. So, what you want to do is use the src attribute. You might have seen this used for images, the img tag. Remember this? Yeah. This actually stands for source, and what you would do is put in the file address of the JavaScript file. For me, it's button.js, and it's in the same directory, so I don't need to do anything besides that. And unlike CSS, we have to specify a whole bunch of things. That's all you have to do. So now we're free to work on our JavaScript file. So JavaScript is actually a somewhat different language. It's a lot like Python and Java, but it's specifically made for websites. You'll see, or as we've seen before, it has no idea what button click is. So we have to define this function. And the way we're doing that in JavaScript is using the function keyword. This will define a function. You should refer to the Python videos for a definition on functions. because they're exactly the same as in Python. Exactly. The name would come then. Let's call it button click, since that's what I named it here. And we need these brackets. It's a lot like Java in that regard. So this is the keyword for it. It's a lot like define in Python. This is the name, alright? Here are the parentheses. In here we would put some parameters, and we also have nothing in here. But that's what this is for, because the the web browser actually needs to know where the function begins and ends. It can't do that with indentations like in Python. So one thing we need to do is actually make a variable. Now this keyword is var, and this stands for variable. It's a simple way to define a variable in JavaScript. We're calling this variable I. You'll notice it's the same color as the function name. That's for a reason. And we're assigning it to 0. JavaScript is I believe a dynamically typed language. So the thing we need to do in this function first is increment this, and I'll explain why afterwards. So I increment this. This is the same increment operator as Java. It looks a lot like Java, funnily enough. JavaScript. Yeah. The next thing we need to do might confuse you, but I'll explain it afterwards. We need to write document.get element by ID, and the ID of the input field that we put in, because that's where the value is, INP. That's what we set this by default. That's this. And that's actually why we define an ID. Dot value equals I. These semicolons are not strictly required, but it's best practice to include them. Now let's explain what each one of these does. I++ increments this function because they've clicked the increment button, and it'll make sense why I'm doing this when we get here. So document refers to button.html, and you're getting the actual HTML element by the ID that you've assigned it. In this case, it's getting the input element because you assigned it the ID INP, and it's getting the value of that input field, not just the default value, but the value you've entered. So it would work with anything you enter. Say 14, the value would then be 14. And now you'll see that this button click function corresponds to this. That's for a reason, because this is actually calling this function on click. As soon as this button is being clicked, that is this button on the website, it calls this function, or this function in JavaScript, and it increments it pretty much. Let's see how this works. If I reload, it increments.